Hey, good morning, everybody. So, welcome to my December office hours. I will be extremely curious to see who's joining me because we ran into a little bit of technical trouble and we had to cancel the event and start the event again. So, if you are out there and I'm not on StreamYard alone, make me feel better about this office hours and send some comments with who you are and who's joining. And my hope is that the folks that join the canceled event will start to see comments, and we'll start to jump over to this rescheduled event. So, and I'm sure that will be interesting for those of you that see this and recording that we're off to a little bit of a rough start. But that's the fun of live events. Frankly, is the Q&A is really fun, but you always run the risk of audio or video or Wi-Fi or something going astray. Elena, I could not be more pleased that you are joining us to know that some folks have made the jump over. That's really great. Raul as well, welcome. So if you could tell me where you're joining from, and also because of the topic today, because we're talking about Muhammad, welcome. Um, uh, Joy, welcome as well, joining from Liberia, wonderful. So I'm curious not only where you're joining from in the world, and thanks so much for monitoring my feed and making the jump over to this invite. We actually have a bunch of folks that have made the jump over. I'm terribly pleased. If you could, I'm also super curious about which side hustle topic is of greatest interest to you, and you can just put that in the chat. So, could be conference speaking. It could be getting involved in book authoring in one way or another. And at the risk of ruining the surprise, that doesn't have to be that you are lead author all alone on a book project. So I'm very curious about which side hustle topic is of greatest interest to you. And I'm sure we'll talk about multiple ones, but we'll focus on the ones that folks are talking about. Great. We've got folks joining from all over. And thanks again for your patience, especially those of you that are joining in the middle of the night. That you were patient and figured out what was going on and jumped over. So let me tell you a little bit about the whole history behind this monthly event that I'm doing now for the second time. So I've been doing data science in one form or another since the 70s. You have to kind of decide when you want to start counting. I was doing more traditional statistics stuff in the mid 90s and was contemplating. I just want to acknowledge in the chat, Gus had mentioned soft skills for analytics. We may touch upon that a little bit, but I think that might be another office hours, Gus. So keep your eyes open for that. That would be a great topic all by itself. I have a LinkedIn learning course on that. But in any case, I was doing more traditional statistics stuff, and some of you may know bits and pieces of this story. But I was contemplating grad school and started teaching SPSS statistics software classes for SPSS. In fact, let me see if I lean this way or the other. You can probably see there's a stack of SPSS statistics for dummies there on the stairs. So I got involved in that, and that really became a career. So grad school never happened, and I did a lot of SPSS statistics training for several years, and that opened the door to a lot of other things. But the reason that I've been so active in doing side hustle in one form or another over all these years, if you start counting from when I finished my undergrad and basically had to go out in the world and pay the bills, 90% of that at least has been freelance. At least 90%, probably a tad more than 90%. I have had some more traditional jobs, whatever you want to call them, 9-to-5 jobs where I'm drawing a salary. But even when I've done that, a substantial amount of the salary work that I've done has been part-time to allow time to do side hustles. So that's really kind of where this journey started for me. And in 2009, that itself is quite a few years ago now, IBM bought SPSS. And I didn't know what that was going to mean for the SPSS community. I wasn't really placing a bet on whether I thought it was good or if it was going to be bad or what have you, but I knew that it would be different. So I wanted to diversify myself, and in this year in 2022, unfortunately, diversifying your career is a topic that's really, I think, appropriate to have again, because in my case, this was this kind of individual uncertainty that I was experiencing because a fairly small company with just a few hundred employees was bought by a much, much bigger company with hundreds of millions of employees, and many millions anyway. I'm not sure. Somebody probably knows. In fact, I bet there's an IBMer here that can give us the current tally for IBM employees, but orders of magnitude bigger than SPSS. But now we're kind of going through uncertainty in general, in fact, across the world economy. And I think that what you do is, if in your spare time, if you're fortunate enough to have a salary job, if in your spare time you're making an effort to do some personal branding and pursue some side hustle. Gus mentioned SPSS. Gus, if you could clarify, you started using SPSS in 96, or were you at SPSS in 96? I started training the winter of 97, 98. So I go back to pretty much the same time period. And I was a user of it before that. But if you pursue this kind of side hustle and personal branding in your discretionary time, the day might come that you are worried about your career or your current role for whatever reason. And I think that even though, if you haven't done it, freelancing feels risky, full-time employment is risky, But I'm not saying one is better than the other. What I'm saying is they both have risks associated with them, because as many of us have experienced at one time or another, if we have a source of income that we're relying upon and it's suddenly not there, that's kind of a scary thing. So one of the things with side hustle, especially when you're full-time side hustle, and I don't know if you've contemplated it that way, that you can basically do side hustle as a career, not only on the side. So I probably have at least a half dozen sources of income, enough that I don't really always count them, but between books, and books frankly don't bring in a ton of money, but conference speaking, consulting, and various other things, there's job security in that, because it's not like 6 or 8 sources of income are all going to disappear at the same moment. So again, I've been monitoring the chat, very interested to know which types of side hustle are most interesting to this group. Is it conference speaking? Is it book authoring? What brings you here today? Or perhaps someone has a question. And again, I can kind of continue with this contextual background while I'm waiting for some feedback there. So in 2009, there was kind of this transition that I knew was going to change my career. I didn't know if it was for better or worse. I just knew that change was coming. So I concluded that, wouldn't it be great if someone needed SPSS training, if somehow they found, me directly, and not only through SPSS or not only through IBM. It's not that I wanted to no longer take advantage of those channels, but rather I wanted to diversify, to have this kind of security that I've been describing. So what I started to do was look into books. That's when I launched my website, and I'm much more active on LinkedIn than I am on my website, but that's when I started to do a bit of personal branding. And since no one stated a preference yet, let's start with books. So in 2013, now you might say, "Oh, Keith, I'm kind of losing the story here because you said that you got a little nervous about a career transition in 2009, but you wrote your first book in 2013." Well, that's true. Okay. But you would be surprised how long it takes to start on this personal branding journey and why you should start now. Now, many folks would be faster than I was at the time, but part of it is educating yourself about what your options are, which of course is why we're here today. So the actual act of writing the book probably took about 1.5 to 2 years. I know that sounds like a long time, and it's possible to do it faster, but I know a lot of authors, and certainly I didn't break a record on the slow end, taking that long. So let me tell you a little bit about the story of how it happened. So I reached out to an expert, and in fact, one of the co-authors of CRISP-DM. CRISP-DM is the cross-industry standard process for data mining, which was written in the late 90s, but was particularly important within the SPSS community because a lot of the authors of the document were SPSSers. Anyone just acknowledge in the chat if you're familiar with CRISP-DM? And if you know my LinkedIn learning courses, then you may know this name. The gentleman's name is Tom Cavazza, is one of the lead authors of CRISP-DM, and he's a wonderful guy, extremely knowledgeable guy that's been doing this kind of machine learning AI stuff since the late 80s, actually. So I reached out to him, and we contemplated writing an introductory book to what used to be called years ago Clementine, that was then SPSS Modeler, and eventually IBM SPSS Modeler. So this was the personal branding. I figured this was the way to do it. And I reached out to Tom, and this is kind of critical to understand how this co-authoring stuff works. Tom was much more well-known than me at the time in the SPSS community. I had my little niche doing the training. I was not unknown, but he was more well-known. But I said, Tom, why has no one written an introductory book in our topic? And he said, well, I've always wanted to write one, but I haven't had the time. And this is really the key. And I mentioned this in my LinkedIn learning course. It's really a critical piece that if folks that have time, because they've set aside time to do personal branding and side hustle, collaborate with folks that are more established but busy, that can make a really powerful team. So we drafted a table of contents. We thought about what topics we wanted to talk about. We discussed, should we self-publish? Should we work with a publisher? All those kinds of conversations. This went on for several months, and it's not unusual that the initial planning goes on for several months, even before you have a contract and so on. It takes time. So out of the blue, and this is often the way it happens, I got an email from an acquisitions editor at Packt. Packt is fairly well-known publishing house in the technical space. It's spelled P-A-C-K-T. Some of you may be familiar with it. And again, that would be interesting to see in the comments whether or not anybody's familiar with Packt, or maybe has read Packt books, or maybe even written Packt books. But this acquisitions editor reached out to me and had a very specific notion about what they wanted covered regarding SPSS Modeler. So, but what was funny about this is that Tom and I were already planning to collaborate on something. Now, you may know this if you know my work. The first book that I was involved with was what's called a cookbook. So in technical books, when you write a cookbook, it's a very specific format. It's short. Kailash, how wonderful that you're joining. That's great to see your name in the comments there. Welcome. So The idea of a cookbook and technical books is the chapters are very brief. They're 3 to 5 pages, and they always address some specific issue. Like, I'm not going to state this very well, something like how to do a complicated data integration and with three or more data sets or something like that, an SPSS modeler. So you state the problem, you solve the problem step by step, and then there's supporting files. That's the idea of a cookbook. So we were going to write an introductory book, but the acquisitions editor says we've been looking for somebody to do a cookbook. Now, naturally, the two projects overlap to some degree. So next thing you know, we said, well, this fell in our lap. It solves a problem that we've been struggling with, which is, should we self-publish or should we go to a publisher? And if so, which one? So why not? And I recruited Colin Shear, who, if you're an SPSS fan, possibly you know his name. He was the gentleman that really kind of innovated and invented Clementine, again, this product that became IBM SPSS Modeler. He did the foreword, and Tom and I both contributed, and we recruited 3 others. So we had 5 co-authors. We had a well-known person do the foreword, and we had, I think, at least 2 or 3 technical reviewers who contributed by looking through the material. But collectively, we had way more than a century of experience, and the book did very well. Now, when I say very well, if a technical book sells several thousand copies, it's done very well. You know, technical books and Harry Potter have very different numbers. So this isn't something that you retire on by a long shot. In fact, when you write a book, if you calculate the number of hours that you've invested compared to your compensation, it probably would be disheartening if you actually calculated what your hourly compensation would be for a book. Now, there are exceptions. There are books that really hit a home run, but I'll tell you that that book changed everything for me in many ways, because ever since then, almost every year until recently, my career has moved in a different direction now. But for at least the first decade after 2009, I could probably attribute at least one consulting gig to that book. In fact, even last year, even in 2020, that would be the case, that I could attribute a consulting gig directly to that book. Now, if you do that and you think about almost a dozen consulting gigs coming out of the book, now that's real money. So the royalties is not, but all of that consulting work is something you can build a career around. So what are kind of some of the lessons learned here, right? And I discussed this in my LinkedIn Learning course, because I'm sure you've picked up on this, but the whole idea of these office hours is we take a topic that I'm addressing in the LinkedIn Learning things and allow you to be able to interact with me and ask questions. So I walk you through this pretty carefully in the LinkedIn Learning course, but basically the notion is writing a book doesn't mean that you're all alone. You have to do everything yourself, and then you have to market it yourself and so on. You can get help, and help can come in the form of co-authoring with someone. Again, the person with more time, collaborating with a person that has more reputation. That's a great way to do it. Another thing that you can do is have multiple co-authors, as I did in that first book. So if you divide the royalties by 5, and the royalties aren't very much to start with, then a small amount divided by 5 is a really small amount. But it was a small amount to start with. So since it's not about the royalties, I tend to say the more the merrier, but there's a downside. The downside is that when you're multi-authored, 3, 4, 5 authors, I imagine it's possible to have more. There is a way to have more. Actually, you can have kind of like an edited work. There's a book back there on the shelf that I contributed, actually co-authored one chapter in a book where every chapter was different authors. That was kind of a more academic style book, but there's definitely ways to do this multi-author thing. But here's the downside. The downside is not that you're splitting the royalties multiple ways. That doesn't matter, because it's not a big number anyway. The downside is somebody has to organize all those co-authors. So in the case of the first book, that was really me. So I was able to borrow the combined reputations of all of these folks by taking on that additional responsibility. So these days, it's like if you're active on LinkedIn, which you very possibly could be given the nature of today's event. If you're active on LinkedIn, you may notice that you might post something, but you say something particularly insightful, and somebody that has a lot of followers comments or shares it to their feed, and all of a sudden you might only have 1,000 followers, but 5,000 people might read this article or post that you did. That's kind of what you're doing, right? By having multiple authors, it's like your followers, so to speak. I know that it's a book and not a feed, but your combined followers is really what matters, and you get more eyeballs on the book. But somebody has to take that organizing role. The good news is that if you're starting out on your personal branding and side hustle journey, you're probably willing to provide that extra effort and that extra time. And if you are willing to provide that extra effort and that extra time, you're going to have a much easier time recruiting really quite well-known co-authors. Get to know them, reach out to them. I also give advice in the course that you should look for a book that you think needs a revision. Maybe there's some new technologies or some new things that are going on. Okay. I'm looking at, I'm scrolling back through the comments here, and I noticed that quite a few folks were curious about bioinformatics. I don't think of that so much as a side hustle strategy. Help me out a little bit on where that might fit in on the bioinformatics, because I'd be very curious to take a look at that. And after I finish talking about books, I want to talk about teaching and conference speaking. Please add additional comments if there are other things that you want me to address. Okay, so basically, if you're willing to bring your effort and labor to a project, you're probably going to be able to find some pretty cool collaborators. Okay, now regarding and then somebody had a comment here about internships. I think, the thing with internships, I was just actually having a conversation with a colleague about internships a couple of days ago. And the thing about internships is that even when they're unpaid, which sometimes they might be, or modestly paid, these days they're still competitive. So I think all the personal branding and things that we're talking about, like developing a data science portfolio and so on, are important, even when you're seeking out an internship as opposed to a role. So I know the whole idea of an internship is that you seek out an internship when you don't have an extensive resume yet. However, these days I would tend to think that you want to have something in the form of a portfolio, which probably means you're doing some things on your own even before you can score that internship. And Safina, please follow up if you want to ask additional questions like that. But that's the quick version on the authoring side of the book, or the co-authoring rather. So what about being a technical reviewer? I think this is a fabulous way to start. So go look at the credits, the opening pages of your favorite technical books, and then look up the authors on LinkedIn. Do you have any connections in common? What do you like about the book? Follow their LinkedIn feed. Now, LinkedIn etiquette does dictate that you don't send out a connection request and say, "Hey, Bill, Bob, Mary, whatever. I'd love to connect. Can you help me with something?" Right? That's usually not the best way to start the conversation. So if you start following the author of a technical book that you admire, then first what you want to do is monitor their feed. Are they active on the platform? Leave some comments, like their things. Try to say something insightful. Maybe do a book review of the book that you admire, right? There are ways to start to kindle a relationship, right? But I certainly, if someone reached out to me and then they said, "I love your book," I've got several now, but I love your book. I would love to work on is there any way I could help you on a new edition? Right. But in particular, if they said that, and it wasn't just this random offer, but they said in particular, I think in chapter 7, there are some things that there are some strategies or technologies that didn't exist when you wrote that chapter 5 years ago that exist now, and I think would be a great addition to the chapter. If someone sent me an email like that, I'm going to reread that thing like twice. That's going to be like, wow, this is like really interesting. Someone's giving me feedback, like out of the blue. So would that I then suddenly take on a co-author with somebody that I've never met before? Maybe, but it would be a long shot because co-authoring with somebody is kind of a big deal. My co-author, Jesus Salcedo, who we're working on a revision now, so I generally talk to him about once a week. We've been friends for more than a decade, right? So it's a no-brainer when we go to do a book project. If our bandwidth allows, we collaborate on something. But that's kind of an intense relationship. So would I necessarily co-author with somebody that sent me an email out of the blue? I really would consider it. But easier would be if somebody wanted to be a technical reviewer on a revision. I could totally picture that happening. You reach out to an author that you admire, you make some suggestions on improvements they could do to a new edition. You'd be surprised how often you might reach out to them with advice like that, and they might actually be in the middle of a revision. A lot of technical books are done about once every 3 years or so. If they're successful, they come out in a new edition. So, if it just came out 6 months ago, that strategy might not work. But is everybody familiar with what a technical reviewer does? A technical reviewer for a technical book is basically like a beta tester. You follow all the steps. So if it's a Python-based book, you'd be running the Python or whatever. You'd be going to the GitHub. You'd be running things. My books tend to be more visual programming. So it's more like a flow chart. It's more point and click, so to speak, although there's usually some coding in there. And you're testing all that stuff to see if it works. And then you're leaving some comments. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over a little bit to teaching, but please do leave some additional comments if there are more topics that you want us to cover, because we're just about at the halfway point. So what about teaching? I would say that, the teaching economy has changed a bit when I started. Okay, so let me briefly tell you about, I'm going to be quite brief because I really think this scenario doesn't exist so much anymore. When I started out as an SPSS trainer, I used to teach intense all day short format workshops that would be 1 day, more commonly 2 days, or sometimes even 3 days in length. So I would drive up to Washington, D.C. from my home in Raleigh-Durham, where I've lived for many years. And I would have the same folks sitting in a physical classroom with me from 8:30 to 5 or so, all day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, let's say, to teach something like regression. That kind of teaching I don't think exists anymore. But although it's moved online, software vendors and conferences need instructors. Okay. So there's a couple of things you do to investigate whether or not something is going to potentially be an option. Okay. So for instance, when I was doing training for SPSS, I was doing it as side hustle. Now that side hustle was by the day, so I was a day laborer, so to speak. I was getting in the U.S. the distinction is if you're on salary, that's listed on what's called a W-2 tax form, and I was a 1099. So I think in Europe, for instance, I think that's called a casual worker or a freelancer, however you want to describe it. But I was a freelancer, but I was super, super busy with them, working almost all the time. So I knew through the grapevine that being an independent contractor was an option. Now, in contrast, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty active in the KNIME community now, KNIME Analytics Platform, KNIME. And when I look at who's teaching KNIME classes, with very, very few exceptions, the official KNIME classes tend to be taught by KNIME employees. So that's the first thing you want to figure out, is that does it seem to be open to independent contractors, or is it mostly employees? Obviously, your opportunities to do it as side hustle are going to be greater if you notice that there are some external consultants teaching classes from time to time, and then you want to reach out to the organizers. But I would encourage you to reach out either way. Say, you know, I really admire this software or this. Now, of course, if it's open source, which many things in data science are now, there's no corporate entity necessarily to reach out to. But, you know, we can be more broad about this. Like, you know, you got things like RStudio and, you know, and that kind of stuff is companies. So they're not like the official place to go to R, but they have an IDE, they have an environment, and people might need training for that. So going the corporate route like I did might be less common now, but conferences need workshops too. So I think the best way to get involved in short format, like this workshop type teaching, is probably to try to do a conference workshop that at first is possibly unpaid. Okay. So in fact, it probably is. So what you want to search for is you want to search for the conferences that you're intrigued with. For instance, ODSC is one of my favorites. I haven't been going to it for many years. I've only been going for about 1 year, but it's such a fantastic conference. And if you go to the ODSC website, they'll have a call for speakers. However, here's a little bit of a cautionary tale about this teaching and speaking business. When you go to the call for speakers for ODSC, for instance, by the way, today is the deadline to submit for ODSC East. If you are inspired, you have a few hours left to propose something. There's a second round, but you really want to submit for the first round if you can. That just as an aside. But I know that for that particular conference, they want you to describe your previous speaking experience. And I think this is one of the reasons why, if you go to ODSC, the speaking is consistently really quite good. Okay. So conferences can be kind of divided into 3 categories. One category is it's almost impossible to speak there because it's invited only. Okay. So these are kind of what I call the expo conferences. There is no call for speakers. There's no information even on how to request to speak. They're really not encouraging you to submit. It's really not a thing. These conferences, the speakers are there because their companies got a booth and so on. So it's really a vendor conference where you attend to hear the vendors more than it is kind of a teaching event. Okay. Then there are the conferences like ODSC, again, one of my favorites, that is really looking for experienced speakers. Okay. Then you've got the conferences where they really want lots of people to speak because it's really an attendee conference more than it is an expo conference, and the attendees are learning from each other. So if you're not an experienced speaker, you're going to want to start with those attendee events, as I'm calling them. So you're going to go to the website for the conference, and there's going to be a clearly indicated call for speakers that says, what's your topic? What do you want to talk about? And you apply, and hopefully you get good luck and you get, accepted, right? And you might have to apply several times before you get accepted once. Then hopefully you do a really good job. These talks might be 30 minutes or 45 minutes. Now, I know if you don't have speaking experience, that can feel a little intimidating, even a talk of that length, but hopefully you do a fantastic job. And then you do that 2 or 3 times, you're going to be able to do more. Getting paid to do a conference workshop, which I do quite often. It's actually a non-trivial fraction of my income. It's certainly not the biggest chunk, but it's something that I do a few times a year, and it adds up so that it's this non-trivial contribution to my total income. So it's really, I'm blessed that I'm able to do that. It's very helpful to me. And it gets me in front of audiences, which is fantastic. So to be paid and do that is wonderful. But what I'm trying to say is you have to work your way up to that. So that kind of workshop teaching, start with a conference where candidly it's relatively easy to get a speaking slot. Build up some experience, then try to apply at the kind of conference, like I mentioned, ODSC, where they're looking for experienced speakers, but eventually you'll get there. Okay. Then, and candidly, this takes a couple of years or more, then you work your way up into paid speaking workshops and so on, but you've got to start to develop that. So here's my advice to you, and I think this is really, really important if you're interested in speaking and teaching. If you're fortunate enough to be in a salaried position and you're in a stable financial situation, if you submit to speak on your own time, don't let it interfere with your work. If you get accepted to speak at a conference and you work on the talk in your discretionary time, most organizations will be thrilled that you've been accepted to speak because it makes you look good. It makes them look good. But make sure that your content in no way violates any kind of non-disclosure type stuff. So don't just assume that you can go to a conference and talk about this amazing model that you built for your employer. That could be a real problem. So make sure that the topic is okay. Then make sure that you work on the talk in your spare time and that doesn't interfere with your day job activities. And make sure your boss knows that you're going. They're almost certainly going to support you in that way, right? Now, let's say your boss is a little reluctant and they say, oh, well, Keith, we're really, you already went to a conference earlier this year. I don't know if I can support you to go to like a second one. Oh, key fact. If you get accepted to speak, almost always your registration fee is waived, which is really big, right? So if you go to your boss and you say, I really want to go to a conference, and they say, well, we've already used up the team's conference budget this year. Okay. If you get accepted to speak and you have that registration fee waived, you might be allowed to go to a conference as a full-time employee that you wouldn't be allowed to otherwise. So this is a really important strategy. If you do all this as often as you can while you're in a stable salary situation, then if 2 years from now or 3 years from now, you have a job interruption or you choose yourself to transition or you're considering self-employment or whatever it might be, or we might just have economic situations like we have now. There's a big difference between 5 speaking opportunities under your belt and 0. Okay. So you can't just out of the blue, at least it's not very likely, score a paid gig. But if you're doing this little step-by-step while you're in a salaried situation, then you're starting to develop some experience and some personal branding. If need be, take a day off to go to a conference, but don't start there. Don't assume that you have to do it. If you've been accepted to speak, 90% of bosses are going to say, that's fantastic. You're making the team look good. They're going to really think that's a good thing. It's not unheard of that the reaction is, wow, we're busy. I don't want you distracted by that or whatever. But hopefully I've given you enough advice to add to overcome that if it does happen with some of the things that I've discussed. So now there's a different kind of teaching. Has anybody either experienced or is intrigued with adjunct teaching, as in like at a university? Because this is an interesting topic too. I never did pursue graduate school. And the reason I didn't pursue graduate school is that I started doing SPSS for extra money. And then, as I mentioned, it turned into a career. And then the next thing you know, for 10 to 15 years after that, really from late 90s to 2009, it was really almost every business day that I was doing that. And then the consulting started to come in. So that's why grad school never happened. I didn't have the time, and I was very happy with my career direction. But because I did not do grad school, and because I don't have a PhD, in fact, I don't have a master's, and most people that do data science are fortunate enough to do data science on the level that I've been allowed to do it over the years. Most of my colleagues do have a master's degree. I don't, but after a decade or two, people stopped asking and I stopped worrying about it. But without that graduate degree, I always felt that, oh, Mohammed, thank you for your answer, that you've done some teaching assistantship work, which I'm sure would be very helpful in this regard. Okay. Universities have a hard time attracting and keeping adjuncts. Adjunct just means part-time faculty. Well, you want to be careful. Most universities really don't like it when you use the word faculty, because to be faculty, that's like kind of like a tenure track thing. I don't know all the details, but the thing is, I've been teaching through UC Irvine's continuing education program since 2016, so for quite a long time. But I'm not considered faculty, and I'm careful not to use that word. I'm an instructor in the continuing ed division. That's just the way that they, and most will tell you exactly how you should refer to yourself. But, naturally, students in the classes will say professor or whatever. That it's not a distinction that the student really cares about. So you're there to do a good job. And I was chosen because of my field experience. And that's exactly what they wanted for an applied program with a bunch of career changers. They wanted somebody with a lot of field consulting experience that could speak to not just the academic stuff, because I am kind of a theory geek. So you might be able to tell. In fact, the workbooks aren't in this room. There's a whole nother room with just workbooks anyway. So then my data science books aren't in this room, but I'm kind of a theory geek, kind of a book geek, right? So I can speak to the academic, but they really wanted somebody with field experience. So why is it that universities have a hard time attracting and keeping adjuncts? Anybody know? Anybody care to share that in the comments? Can you guess? The compensation is not very good. And I can say that without offending anyone, because it's across the board. It's true of all universities. The pay is not very good. So why do you do it? Well, there's really two reasons for me, and pay is certainly not either of them. Yeah, someone said low pay, and that's absolutely the case. So pay is definitely not the reason why I do it. I do it for two reasons. One is I think it's a boost. I think it's a boost to my reputation. I think that's fair to say. So I think that certainly to an acquisitions editor, the fact that, well, acquisitions editors love the fact that I do some adjunct teaching, because they also presume in some cases, and it's not always true, but they presume that I'll probably be using the book, in my teaching. But the other reason, and it's very possibly the more important one, is I really value the interaction with students, because when I'm consulting, you can't check on a colleague's. Now, if they're literally a colleague, like they work at the same consulting firm as me, then obviously there's full and open communication, and I can double check their work, and that's something that's encouraged, that kind of mentoring. But when you're working at a client site, you have to be very careful about the appearance of really double checking somebody's work. Like you're not always going to see the code. Obviously, on the modeling, I would be in charge of that. That'd be fine. But I mean, like on the data engineering side and so on, you know what I mean? You have to kind of navigate that. And if you know there's a problem, then you can dig a little bit deeper. But you want to generally be flattering of your client employees' work unless there's a major problem, right? When I'm teaching, I can really dig deep because I'm grading homework. So I know this sounds strange, but the two main reasons that I like teaching for UC Irvine is the boost to my reputation, particularly when it comes to speak or write, and the interaction with students in the form of grading. And people are shocked by that because grading is a bit tedious, right? But by getting to see those mistakes and really digging in there and interacting with students and asking, why did you happen to, this actually wasn't right, and I'm going to show you the correct way, but what was your thought process? How did you head down that incorrect path? That is incredibly powerful for my conference speaking, for my writing, and for my consulting, because I don't have that kind of detailed discussion of why did you screw up, frankly, except when it's with a student, because that's what taking a class is for. So, for instance, I'm revamping a 3-course sequence with UC Irvine now that's going to start in the spring or summer or something like that. And I'm sure for the students that happen to know me that choose to do that certificate, part of it will be that they want to make mistakes in front of me, if that makes sense, where I can evaluate and mentor in a way that, again, even on a consult, it's uncomfortable to have that kind of conversation, right? But this kind of, let me tell you where you went wrong, is a natural conversation to take when you're an adjunct, right? So you may be disappointed that a lot of this side hustle starts as unpaid or underpaid, right? But that over time becomes a reputation building event, which allows you to get more opportunities elsewhere, right? Oh, yeah, Muhammad has a follow-up question on creating online video courses. Yeah, no, that's a really good one. So Muhammad, you have a couple of choices there. You have the go it on your own, the do it yourself route, like YouTube or Udemy. And then you have things like LinkedIn Learning, and they're actually very different. So let's start with YouTube and Udemy. And I did do some Udemy courses when I was an employee of a company, actually. So I have some experience with that. But oh, and I know it's an interesting comment here about yeah, at first I was a little bit confused by that comment, Walter, because I thought you were saying something about me going to Purdue, which of course it was another colleague. Yeah. That's on the call with us. Yeah. So yeah, with Udemy and YouTube, what you're trying to do is you're trying to put your finger on the pulse of the market, and you're trying to produce content that will attract people. And if you're successful and you attract an audience, then on Udemy you're basically self-employed. So you're getting paid per course with a profit share with the platform. And in the case of YouTube, you're trying to attract advertising. Okay. And it can take quite a while to build an audience, but folks that have gone that path can really do quite well, and not only get income from YouTube itself, but really enhance their career. So someone, for instance, that I think has done an amazing job with their YouTube channel is Ken G. I bet some of you know him. And I'm sure at this point, his YouTube channel is clearly quite successful. But also a few months ago, I saw him do a keynote, and keynotes are always paid, so almost always paid. So this was a major keynote at a big event, and that was really amazing. And I'm sure that the keynote opportunity, I don't want to speak for him, but I'm certain I'm right here. I'm sure that the keynote opportunity came from the YouTube. So those are really powerful. LinkedIn Learning, I have to tell you, is a little different. So just as I said, you don't suddenly get paid for speaking unless you've done some unpaid speaking. That's just kind of the reality of it. Same with this. It's going to be pretty hard to get on the LinkedIn Learning platform without prior experience, because it's curated. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to get basically one course per topic that they feel that they need, and then attracting the best author for that topic. So getting invited to teach on LinkedIn Learning was similar to getting invited to write for Wiley. It was a similar process. You kind of do the dance and you have this discussion, but there's a lot of talk about prior experience. Okay. So there is a way to submit a topic on LinkedIn Learning, but you want to watch out for that. It's just like I was talking about earlier with the speaking. It's probably not, possibly not entry level. Now, that's not to say that you have to have a YouTube channel for 5 years before you get invited to LinkedIn Learning. I mean, sure, that could happen. In my case, it was the books that led to the LinkedIn Learning, not Udemy or not channels and so on. So when I say that you're going to have to go in with some experience, it doesn't have to be identical experience. It basically means that you have to have a bit of a reputation. So candidly, all of the things that we've talked about would be enhanced by being active on LinkedIn, for instance. I mean, you could start with posts and articles before you try to take on a book. So that was a fast and furious discussion of a little bit of the writing, the conference speaking, a little bit about the teaching. There's a lot to it. I hope if you haven't seen it that you'll consider checking out the Side Hustle course on LinkedIn Learning. I hope you have access to the platform. Oh, make note of this. On the first Friday of every month, I've done this for about 1.5 years, and very few people follow the hashtag, but the hashtag that I use is Free First Fridays. Clarine, it's wonderful that you've joined us. Thank you for that. I know that Clarine and I were in Creator Accelerator program together, and there were 120 of us, a half dozen of which were also authors. And that's everybody that arrives with all this amazing experience. Like all of my colleagues in the Creator Accelerator are looking for additional platforms in which to reach their audiences. So this question comes up not only for people that are starting out, but also people that are really quite experienced. It might be for whatever reason, that's a platform that they haven't, pursued before. Yeah. So fast and furious again, but make note of this because the first Friday of every month, I use the hashtag Free First Fridays. I hope I'm getting that right. But if you go to my feed, you'll be able to find it because just go back to December. I'm going to be running late here, but we started late. But on December 2nd, if you go back to my feed, I bet you'll be able to find it. On December 2nd, I posted a course. And on January 6th, I will do the same. So even if you don't have access to LinkedIn Learning, if you make a point to follow my feed, maybe even ring that little bell, you know how that works, right? With the bell, then you get all the posts. But if you keep an eye on my feed the first Friday of every month, I always post a class. And if you click on that link, then it's free for 24 hours. And I do that every month. So, so even if you don't have access to LinkedIn Learning, there are ways to get to see at least some of the content. And LinkedIn Learning is very often very generous with this. Once a year when they come out with the best courses of the year, they'll often have 10, 20, 30 courses that they make free for like a month. So what you want to do is when you're in LinkedIn, click on the little play button in the upper right-hand corner. And I have met so many folks over the years that have said, oh, I don't have access to LinkedIn Learning. I'm so sad because there's this course I want to watch. Maybe mine, maybe somebody else's, you know. And they click on the button and they suddenly find that they get it for free and that they didn't know they were getting it for free from work or from school or from the fact that they're a premium member of LinkedIn. So even though we started a few minutes late, and I apologize for that, we should probably finish fairly close on time. Oh, and Clary, thank you. I was afraid I would get tongue-tied. Sometimes my brain says first free instead of free first. But thank you for that. And it's a great way to get a free course a month. And the Side Hustle one is about an hour or so. So you can knock that out in 24 hours. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. I appreciate all of your comments. I'm incredibly thankful for your patience for that first few minutes that we struggled a little bit. And I hope you'll interact with me on LinkedIn. And I hope you'll turn in just about a month's time. It will probably be on January 20th. I'm pretty sure of that. I'll post it. I'll post it in the feed, but I think January 20th will be the next one. And I would love to get your feedback on what topic you'd like to do next. I'll wait for the holidays to get behind us, and then I'll post a poll as I tend to do. But anyway, I look forward to doing these every month, and I hope you'll join me again. Thanks, everybody.